the Vietnam War, and I had asked you to read this article. It's a very interesting analysis of what was going on there. So let's get right into it. Okay, so the article starts off with this examination of the question, what was the Vietnam War really about? And there are three different views. One is this anti-communist view that we were in it, to stop the spread of communism, consistent with our containment policy. Or were we there interfering in a civil war between North and South Vietnam? Or was the United States acting as an imperialist power, trying to crush a nationalist movement? So these are the questions, the different theories we'll be examining in this discussion. So it starts off talking about Lyndon Johnson and his involvement, and he kind of saw it as a conflict similar to what would happen in Korea, that we have that we have a communist nation attacking its neighbor, looking to spread communism. And so that was the theory that he was working from, allegedly. And so that takes us to our first question: which of the three theories does LBJ's logic support? And that supports the first idea that we need to contain communism, and it was urgent due to the domino theory. And that's the idea that if one nation falls to communism, the other nations will fall, the other nations around it will fall as well. And so that justified his involvement, supposedly. Now, Robert McNamara was the Secretary of Defense for Kennedy and Johnson, and he was very, very significant in U.S. involvement in Vietnam, but later he wound up renouncing his wartime claims. And he said if only he had realized that the domino theory was wrong, he might have taken different actions. And of course, this is where hindsight is 20/20, that expression. It perfectly fits in the situation. But the author is suggesting that there was a lot of evidence at the time that McNamara could have looked to disprove his theory that this was an urgent fight. And the author criticizes McNamara, saying that he ignored evidence that was counter to his narrative, such as scholars pointing out that the U.S. was stepping into the shoes of the French as a colonial power. And so the author really supports this, the theory that the United States was acting as an imperialist nation here, that they were putting down a nationalist movement. Okay, going on here, that other critics argue that the United States really shouldn't have gotten involved because South Vietnam was never really an independent nation. That there were many, many people in South Vietnam who were supporting Ho Chi Minh, and they were willing to fight for Ho Chi Minh even though they were in the South. So that group of people was called the National Liberation Front, and they were also called the Viet Cong. So this is the same group of people, and these were the fighters in the South who supported the communists. So if there were people in the North supporting the communist leader and people in the South supporting the communist leader, who was not supporting the communist leader? That's the question. And so this is the idea in the corner here. In the side, I just put a little note here that the South Vietnam was never really an independent nation, but it was one being propped up by the United States to fight against communist foes. All right, and let's move on a little bit more, talking about the journalist Jonathan Schell, and he supports the idea that this was really a civil war because he said that during the time we were fighting, the U.S. was trying to build relationships with communist countries at this time. We have Nixon's visit to China in 1972 and his détente with the Soviet Union, trying to ease tensions. And so this author doesn't really believe that containing communism in Vietnam can be a sincere motive if we're building relationships with communist nations at the same time. Okay, going on a little bit further, we point to the um, Vietnam veteran Daniel Ellsberg, who we know from our Pentagon Papers case when he stole the Pentagon Papers and leaked it to the New York Times and the Washington Post. And there's an excellent movie that I usually show at the end of class right after the AP exams called The Post. And I would recommend that you watch that. It's a fun movie about American history. And Daniel Ellsberg and others supported the idea that this was an anti-colonial struggle because they say that Vietnam was looking for independence after World War II, and the United States financed the suppression of that movement. Then later we see the Ronald Reagan becoming president, and he saw that the war was a noble cause. And I know we didn't discuss Ronald Reagan yet, but he was very firmly anti-communist, supported different groups around the globe that were fighting against communism. So he wanted to be tough on communism. And he points to the idea that maybe we just didn't make the right moves in Vietnam. So he said the United States could have supported Diem, the Southern leader, rather than helping him get overthrown. We could have tried a different military strategy. We could have fought harder and put our whole heart into it. We could have done we could have done a better job winning the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people. And so these are the reasons that we lost, according to Reagan, that it was a good fight, it was worth it. And then I like this part of the article where the author compares our Civil War and involvement by Britain to what was going on in Vietnam. That's just an interesting concept there to think about. And this question I asked for your opinion: which claim do you think is more valuable? Chapman, who was saying that this was a civil war that became internationalized, or the authors, which was an American war that made the divisions within Vietnam worse? And I would have liked to have a discussion about that. So if you wanted, if your parents were interested, you could discuss that with them, or you could write in on our Google document and we could talk about it. I'd be happy to entertain discussion, even if we're not personally together. Okay, and then the article finishes up talking about why this matters. What does it matter to study the Vietnam War and why we were there? Well, you know that we've been fighting this war in Afghanistan since 2001, and we've been fighting in Iraq since 2003, and we have very similar situation in Vietnam because we're fighting a global war on terror, which is kind of similar to our war against communism in that it's fighting an idea. And it's a global fight against an idea. And so there were some mistakes made in Afghanistan and some mistakes made in Iraq, maybe even some misleading information in Iraq that got us involved, and then we couldn't leave because we would have lost. So we got stuck there, and people knew that we were stuck there, and we just couldn't leave, and it still is very complicated. So in a way, it's very, very similar to what happened in Vietnam. And so this is a good point for complexity or synthesis on an essay. Now we know that the AP exam is only going to specifically ask you about sections, units 3 through 7 on that DBQ essay with the 5 documents you'll get. But you are certainly allowed to use information from before or after for the synthesis complexity point. So depending on what topic you get, this might fit in nicely. Okay, have a great day, everybody. Miss you guys.